Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon to everyone watching. This is the Voice of the Cape Matric Revision Program 2023, and this is in collaboration with the Futures Academy SA Online High School. So over the past few weeks, we have been doing revision on various subjects that matriculants need in order to pass the final exams. We have completed History Paper 1 prior to this, but today we will be doing the revision on History Paper 2. And since this is the concluding session for History, which is Paper 2, we will also be doing examination skills. And we are joined today by our guest tutor, and that is Danielle Pretorius, that is doing our revision session today. Good afternoon, Danielle. How are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. And yourself?
Very well. It is a pleasure to have you online with us this afternoon. And for all of the students that are tuned in, if there are any other videos that you might have missed out on, you can find that on our YouTube and streaming pages. If you would maybe like to do additional revision and revisit maybe some tips that you missed. So Danielle, I'll give the stage to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, hi, everyone. This is going to be our last class on this topic or on the history classes. In terms of today's class, what I wanted to cover was we're going to look at some of the source-based questions that are going to come up in your paper 2, as well as then looking at some essay questions, particularly kind of combining the examination skills we did in our first class with the content we have here. So you see how you apply those examination skills to the paper, specifically the paper 2. So just to refresh, in terms of the paper 2 content, we covered the paper 1 last week. In terms of the paper 2, it is the same format. It's 150 marks. It's 50 marks a question. You have to answer one source-based question, one essay question, and then one question can be either a source-based or either an essay to make up a total of 3 questions. You will see what's quite nice in the paper 2 content is that 2 of the topics follow on each other. So your first topic, remember, on the left-hand side, you have your source-based questions, and on the right-hand side, you have your essay questions. So civil resistance, 1970s to 1980s, South Africa. Your question focus, the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. Remember, this is a source-based question. Then the essay option for civil resistance, South Africa, is the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state. Then topic 2, the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. The source-based option is on the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the essay option is on the negotiated settlement and the government of national unity. And then the last topic is the end of the Cold War and a new order, 1989 to the present. Your essay question focus is a new world order. And your essay question focus is the impact of Gorbachev's reforms on the Soviet Union and South Africa. So they kind of follow on each other, all of them, in that this is 1970s to 1980s. Here, the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. This is 1989 to 1994. The TRC is after 1994, and then the end of the Cold War and a new world order, 1989 to the present, in terms of your essay question, focusing on how essentially the collapse of the Cold War or the collapse of the Soviet Union in terms of the Cold War affected South Africa. So all kind of following on each other, particularly these 2 topics. What I want to note here is, again, the same thing as the paper 1. I would recommend that remember you have to do one essay question and one source-based question, and then the third one you can pick if you want to do either a source-based or an essay. Again, I would recommend to do a source-based just because a trend I pick up is that students tend to do better on the source-based. And also just in terms of time, they tend to fare better when answering to source-based instead of to essay questions. So with selecting your questions here, what I think is most convenient probably is to go on these as they are in chronological order. So you have the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state, then you have the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s, then you have the negotiated settlement in the government of national unity, 1989 to 1994, and then post 1994 you have the TRC. So these go in chronological order, which kind of makes them easier to synthesize and kind of string along and put together for yourself. However, what I do want to point out is in terms of your essay question, this coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past, this is a very technical essay question because how the content is structured is there's a lot of negotiation forums, specific acts of violence, specific policies, and it's quite technical. And just an observation from prelims and just in general in past years as well is that students tend to do worse in this essay question compared to the other ones for the same student. So when you're doing this question, make sure that you study the content thoroughly because you will need to refer to specific events, and there's quite a few here. So in terms of our class today, what we're going to look at specifically, I think, granted we won't have time to look at all of them, is this topic, just because it also will segue then into this topic for you to do this one. Civil resistance, 1970s to 1980s. It starts with the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state in the 70s, then in the 80s, the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. So we're going to look at these two. So your crisis of apartheid in the 1980s is your source-based and your essay is Black consciousness. So when we did our paper one class, we looked at the essay question for the Black Power movement, which you can draw some parallels between the Black consciousness movement and the Black Power movement. So kind of similar in terms of the structure. So we'll take a look at that as well. So what I want to show first is just a past paper, just so that you can get your bearings. Okay, so again, the instructions page looks the same as the paper one. The only difference is the topics. So you will see that they are listed here. And then again, just pointing out that your question focus here of the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s is not the same as the actual question. That's just the focus of the question. It could ask you on any of these things here or a combination thereof. So how did the mass democratic movement challenge the segregatory laws of South Africa's apartheid government in the late 1980s? And then you'll see here, here's the mass democratic movement in the response to Botha's reforms. So the crisis of apartheid is just the question focus, and these are the things you need to know under them because they could ask you to focus on any one of these. So in terms of the essay question then, let's look at the other ones. So this question, let's go to question 2 first. So this is the TRC question. So what can South Africans learn from the role played by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 1995 to 1998? And then here we have the TRC reasons, various forms of justice, debates, preparations. So that's this one. So although the question focus is just TRC, there are something specific on that. And then the last essay question option, which is on the globalization topic, it says, how committed have developing countries of BRICS been to global climate change issues between 2000 and 2021? So for the globalization questions, important to remember that although the content is like international, conversely to these two topics, which are just South African history. The way that they phrase the questions is always through a South African lens. So in this example, it speaks about the developing countries of BRICS. So the S is South Africa in BRICS. So you'll see here, it identifies roles that South Africa has to play. So they ask questions still with the kind of more focus on South Africa and Africa. Similarly, with the end of the Cold War and a New World Order, they want you to know the events in Eastern Europe, but also how it was a turning point in South Africa. So you'll see that in the essay questions. So here's an example of a Black consciousness essay. So question focus, challenge of Black consciousness. Look at the essay question. It's not just the challenges. So the philosophy of Black consciousness successfully instilled Black people with pride and self-belief to start challenging apartheid South Africa in the 1970s. Do you agree with the statement? Support your line of argument with relevant historical evidence. And then the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. This question is on the negotiated settlement and the government of national unity. The specific question that they have here is explain to what extent compromises by different role players remained a key feature that paved the way for a new political dispensation in South Africa in 1994. And then your globalization question, which pertains to the impact of Gorbachev's reforms on the Soviet Union and South Africa. An example of a specific question that you could get for this one would be policy changes by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union from 1985 led to its disintegration in 1991. However, they also brought positive results for South African politics. Critically discuss the statement, support your line of argument with relevant historical evidence. So what you should be picking up here on, and I noted this in the paper one class as well, is that your question focus is not the same as your actual question that you get. So with essay questions and with source-based questions, I think it's really helpful to go through past papers and just see kind of how they pinpoint it to a specific question so that you can get used to that and kind of see how you need to take the information and apply it to this specific part of the topic. So we will start with the section A, the first question, which is on the mass democratic movement. So this is I believe you did this in term 2, and it's essentially on after the Black consciousness movement, or because of the Black consciousness movement, resistance picked up in the 1980s. And it's asking you about the mass democratic movement, which is essentially an umbrella body, which when the United Democratic Front was banned, a lot of just different organizations just started working underneath this umbrella term of the mass democratic movement. It was not an official organization. So we'll keep this open here, where they speak about the growing power of trade unions, the United Democratic Front, the mass democratic movement, etc. Okay. So again, we start with the sources, and then you'll see that just right off the bat, before we've been looking at the sources, level 1 question, higher order question, level 1 question. You can see by the mark allocations as well. So for this one, if it ever says according to the source, that means your answer is going to be found in the source, and you have to give your answer according to the source. So we'll look at the sources for this one. Okay, so in terms of how the mass democratic movement challenged the segregatory laws of South Africa's apartheid government in the late 1980s. So remember that the little paragraph here gives you context about usually when the source was written, what it is about, what it's going to discuss. So here it says the source below is an extract that outlines the formation of the mass democratic movement in South Africa in 1989 and how it challenged apartheid government's racial legislation. Okay. So, the MDN was the name of an informal coalition of anti apartheid groups during the 1970s and early 1980s. As a formal organization, the Mass Democratic Movement was established as an anti apartheid successor to the United Democratic Front after the 1988 emergency restrictions effectively banned the United Democratic Front and several other opposition groups. The UDF introduced the term mass democratic movement, and it said that the MDM should strengthen grassroots structures and bringing all those organizations on the periphery, thus involving them in the struggle. Many previously excluded groups, including white groups and homeland groups, were invited to an anti-apartheid conference organized by COSATU in September 1988. So COSATU, trade unions. So the government did not approve and banned the conference. Even after 1988, the Mass Democratic Movement was a temporary loose coalition of anti-apartheid activists with no permanent constitution, no official membership roles, no national or regional governing body, and no office holders. Like the UDF, the MDM drew much of its support from the Black community. A condition for affiliation with the Mass Democratic Movement was adherence to the provisions of the ANC's Freedom Charter. The MDN gained importance in 1989 when it organized a campaign of civil disobedience in anticipation of national elections scheduled to take place in September of that year. Defying the state of emergency regulations in effect at the time, several hundred Black protesters entered whites-only hospitals and beaches. During that month, people of all races marched peacefully in several cities to protest against police brutality and repressive legislation. Okay, so here we have the where the source has been taken from as well. And then source 1b is just a picture. Source 1c, we'll read that just now, and source 1d is another textual source. You will note a common trend is that for each question, they usually always include a visual source as well. So here for question 2, you have text, visual, text, text. Question 3, text, 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 visual. Okay, so you will generally always get a visual source as well. So, which organization, according to the source, was established as an anti-apartheid successor to the UDF in 1988? Okay, then look for these keywords, anti-apartheid successor to UDF. So, here, the Mass Democratic Movement was the name of an informal coalition of anti-apartheid groups. As a formal organization, the MDN was established as an anti-apartheid successor to the United Democratic Front. So your answer is the Mass Democratic Movement, in brackets, if you will, MDN. So 1 times 1 equals 1. Usually if it's a lower order question like this, your answer comes right out of the source as well. So this is just comprehension skills. What, according to the UDF, was the Mass Democratic Movement expected to achieve in the struggle against apartheid? Give 2 responses. So according to the UDF, so in the source, the UDF introduced the term Mass Democratic Movement. It said that the MDN should strengthen grassroots structures, 1, and bring in all the organizations on the sidelines, thus involving them in the struggle. So a lot of your lower order questions, the answer just comes right out of the source. And for safety, just rather write it over as it appears there. You will see that most of the times the memo also says, it will say extraction of evidence, and then it will give it as it is implication of the statement, a condition for affiliation with the MDN was adherence to the provisions of the ANC's Freedom Charter in the context of the struggle against apartheid. Okay, so 2 times 2 equals 4. Remember what we learned about a mark allocation. That means we need to give 2 complex responses for 2 marks to get the total of 4 marks. So note that this is a comment on question. So what do you do for a comment on question? So essentially, all they're asking you to do is to explain what that means in the case of the uh, the fight against apartheid. So when they say comment on the implication of the statement, they're basically just asking you what does it mean. So when we look at what it means, specifically the key part here is this in the context of the struggle against apartheid. So a condition for affiliation with the MDM was adherence to the provisions of the ANC's Freedom Charter. So what that means, a condition for affiliation, if you wanted to be affiliated or be part of the mass democratic movement, you had to adhere or agree to the provisions or the things laid out in the ANC's Freedom Charter. So essentially, you would have to support the ideals of the ANC to be part of the mass democratic movement. So what they're asking is essentially just what does that actually mean? What is the message? So you will see here that it says all organizations wanting to be part of the MDN should adopt the demands of the ANC's Freedom Charter. The struggle for liberation was aimed at the realization of the fundamental principles of the Freedom Charter. Organizations joining the mass democratic movement must be anti-apartheid. So they're asking, what does that mean in terms of the struggle against apartheid? Then explain the term civil disobedience in the context of activities organized by the mass democratic movement. This would just be your own knowledge, as in passive resistance campaigns, non-violent civil disobedience. You may have been able to get this as well if you're studying the civil rights section for your paper 1 in the America topic. Okay, so here we have a explain the messages question, and they particularly like to ask these with pictures. So let's look at the picture. Okay, so especially with a visual source, this context here is quite important. So this photographer unknown below, was taken at the whites only Addington Hospital in Durban on 2 August 1989. It highlights a protest against segregation as part of the MDN's Open Hospital campaign. Okay, so people are holding banners. It says desegregate hospitals. NUSA supports open hospitals. There's people of all races standing here. There's quite a lot of people. So it says, what is the messages conveyed in the photograph regarding MDN's open hospital defiance campaign? So again, the mark allocation means you need to give 2 complex responses. So you need to explain 2 messages. So remember, with a message, the turnout looks, what they're talking about. So the first thing that I would do is I would discuss what I'm seeing physically. So we're seeing a lot of people protesting, people of different races. They're holding up boards like desegregate hospitals, NUSA supports open hospitals, germs don't discriminate. So, what this shows us in terms of MDN's Open Hospital Defiance campaign against segregation is that a variety of groups were involved here in the, for example, with the NUSA supports open hospitals. We also see that the people that came to protest was not a racially separated group; it was a racially inclusive group. So you'll see here um, apartheid laws promoting discrimination in hospitals are condemned, challenged by groups affiliated to the MDN, for example, the NUSAS we mentioned. Uh, Protesters belong to different racial groups, the inclusion of NUSAS. A call is made by the mass democratic movement to desegregate and open all hospitals. They rejected health provisioning and the treatment of people based on apartheid discrimination. They wanted hospitals to be desegregated. So already you could hit a lot of those just by physically describing what you're seeing here. So when you're answering a question about what message, state the message and then say, as seen by, for example, the poster saying NUSA supports open hospitals, or they're calling for the desegregation of hospital facilities, for example, with the poster saying desegregate hospitals. Okay, and then it says comment on the racial composition, 1 times 2. They just want you to say that people of different races took part in the campaign. Okay, and then we have a question about how one source supports the other source. So do you note that particularly with this question, there's a lot of like history skill questions. And if you didn't know how to answer these questions, like the comment upon, explain the message, comment on, comparison of sources, you would struggle to do this across the board, regardless of what the question is. So knowing these history skills is also a particularly important part of studying for history. So it asks you to explain how the information in source 1A supports the evidence in source 1B regarding the defiance campaigns organized by the mass democratic movement against segregatory laws. Okay, so what do we do when we want to compare sources? So, when you are asked to compare information from sources, whether it be similarities or differences, you are expected to gather information from both sources which correspond or differ to each other. For example, you will say source A says this and source B confirms this by saying. So, you get 1 mark for one comparison, not 1 mark each for saying this source says this, that source says this. Compare them. And then you need to give 2 comparing responses for the 2 times 2 equals 4. So we're looking for things about campaigns organized by the mass democratic movement against segregatory laws, and we're looking for 2. So here it says there's a protest against segregation as part of the mass democratic movement's open hospital campaign. Here it says that here it says they gained prominence when the campaign of civil disobedience, defying state of emergency regulations, entered whites only hospitals and beaches. So, source 1A speaks about the civil disobedience and people entering whites only hospitals and beaches, while source 1B visually depicts civil disobedience at a protest of the MDN's open hospital campaign. So now we need one more. So it says here it was a temporary loose coalition of anti-apartheid activists with no permanent constitution, no official membership roles, no office holders. It also says here that many previously excluded groups were invited or were part of the UDF then. So you could also make that comparison in that there is people of different races here and there's different groups. It's not just the mass democratic movement. It's an umbrella term of different groups. And you see that with the NUSAS. So you will see that reflected in the memo then. So here it says Source 1A refers to MDN protesters against whites only hospitals, and source 1B depicts them against segregation at whites only hospital. Both sources highlight civil disobedience. Both sources show multiracial protests. So you had to give any two of those. Okay, so here are some more questions. I don't want to go over too many of these. Rather just would like to go over the more higher order ones, like this one, comment on the usefulness. So this is source 1C. We're still looking at the crisis of apartheid. Okay, source 1C. The source below is an extract from a book written by historian A. Jeffrey. It explains the events that took place during the Peace March to the Cape Town City Hall that was organized by the Mass Democratic Movement against police brutality on 13 September 1989. So, what are they talking about? A peace march to the Cape Town City Hall against police brutality. So, in the aftermath of the election, the MDN pledged to intensify the defiance campaign. Tutu and Busak said that they would lead a march on Parliament when it reconvened on 13 September 1989 to express outrage against police killings on Election Day. The day before the protest, Tutu announced that the march would go to Cape Town City Hall rather than to Parliament. He added that the march would be peaceful and disciplined, but stressed that there could be no question of the protest being abandoned. They have killed our people, he said. It did not matter whether the death toll was 23, as he had first stated, or 15, as the police said. 15 is a massacre. Even if we deal with only their figures, it is a scandal. Encouraged by assurances from the Reverend Johan Haynes, moderator of the Dutch Reformed Church, that the march would be nonviolent, de Klerk allowed it to proceed, saying, "We cannot have a democracy without protest marches." De Klerk added that there was no reason for people to give vent to their political aspirations through disorderly protest or rioting. The door to a new South Africa is open. It is not necessary to batter it down, he said. The march passed peacefully and signaled the de facto unbanning of the ANC. ANC flags and banners were prominently flown. Placards with ANC slogans were openly displayed, ANC freedom songs were sung, and ANC leaders were praised. Tutu and Busak addressed the crowd from the balcony of the City Hall, which was adorned or decorated with the flags of the ANC and the UDF. Walk Cape Town open, the posters declared. The police kept a low profile and no action was taken to enforce the ban on the ANC or the restrictions on the United Democratic Front. And then it says, From People's War, New Light on a Struggle for South Africa by A. Jeffrey. So they're asking us here if the source would be considered useful. So comment on the usefulness of the source to historians studying the events that took place during the Peace March to the Cape Town City Hall on 13 September 1989. Okay, so with a usefulness, it's different than a reliability question. A source can be useful but not reliable. So you need to note that they ask for two different things. So if a source is useful, it asks you, can the historian use it? Will they be able to get a lot of information out of it on what they're studying? In this case, the events that took place. Reliable is, can we rely on the information in the source as evidence? Can we believe what is written there? Where useful is, can we use what is written there? So it says we should look at what the source tells us, the validity of it as well. Who created the source, when it was created. Look at the purpose. Is it informative or opinionated? Is the source positive or negative? Would it be typical at the time? What does the source not show us? Can you relate the source to another? So in this case, we would say that it is useful. So please remember to do that. If it says comment on the usefulness, it's not telling you it's useful or not. You have to say it is useful or it is not useful. So you need to start your answer with that. So the source is useful to a researcher studying the events that took place during the Peace March to the Cape Town City Hall on 13 September 1989, as it details exactly what happened and the reasons for the march. It also details what prominent figures like Tutu said, and what de Klerk's response was. So it gives us information on how the apartheid government responded, gives us the reasons for the march, and it also gives quotes, which could be quite useful to understand um, uh, what the atmosphere was and where the people are coming from prominent leaders of the mass democratic movement like Tutu and Busak. So you will see that then in the memo, just probably a bit shorter than what I said it. So it was 1.4.5. So you have to say this, the source is useful or not. But in this case, the source is useful. So if you said it's not useful, it would be incorrect. So it's a book by an academic and renowned author of history books. The date of the Peace March was on the day Parliament had to reconvene. It explains the events that took place. It highlights the prominent leaders. It includes direct words or quotations from leaders. It gives insight into the new path of reform. So this would be what we said about gives insight about the apartheid government's response, any other relevant response. Okay. So I hope it makes sense how you take the information and apply it. With the source base, I think what you would have noticed is that a lot of times the information that you're studying in terms of content is to make these things make sense. Because if you read these sources without the context and the background that your notes provide you, then it wouldn't make sense. So there are a lot of instances where you have to add your own knowledge. But with the source base, a lot of times the answer comes out of the source. It's just you need to be able to understand the source to answer the questions, and you won't be able to understand the source if you haven't covered the content in your textbook. So before we switch to the essay question, which is what I really want to get into, I just want to take note of the paragraph question again. So remember that your paragraph question is the same as this question. How did the MDN challenge the segregatory laws of South Africa's apartheid government? Paragraph question, how the MDN challenged the segregatory laws. Similarly, here, the question is on how can South Africans learn from the role played by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And here, your paragraph question is, explain what South Africans can learn from the role played by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Okay, so what that means is that all the sources in the addendum that you've gotten are about this question. So the information that you will use to answer your paragraph question is going to come from the sources. Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your sources, so question 1, and through the whole source, all you're just looking for the whole time is how the MDN challenged segregatory laws of South Africa's apartheid government. I think what's also important is, okay, you're getting your information from the sources, but making sure that you extract the relevant information from the source. Otherwise, you're just giving random information. It still needs to be relevant to the question. So we're looking on stuff on how they challenge the laws. So then you just go through every source, you take a highlighter, and you look at how instances or examples of how they did it. So here they say they introduced mass democratic strength and grassroots structures. And then here it says it was an establishment. So maybe you could start with this informal coalition of anti-apartheid groups, making sure to say anti-apartheid groups. And then here, so it organized campaign of civil disobedience. It defied state of emergency regulations. from source 1A. From source 1B, you could say that they were at a protest against segregated hospitals as part of their open hospital campaign. Here, again, we're looking for how they challenge segregatory laws. So here, they intensified their defiance campaign, where they led a march on parliament. Here, the march passed peacefully. It signaled the actual unbanning of the ANC. Placards with ANC posters were openly displayed, even though it said here no action was taken to enforce the ban on the ANC or restrictions on the UDF. Here, you could also say, so here the police were acting to enforce apartheid. They were not prepared to tolerate civil disobedience activities. So they were doing civil disobedience activities. And then you can get examples here as well. So you would just go through every source and look for information pertaining to how they challenge segregatory laws, and then you'll put it together. So you'll see that because it's 8 marks, how your paragraph question is marked is it's marked holistically. So that doesn't mean you need to give 8 facts. You will see that for your paragraph questions, you get marked not only on your facts, but also your style. So this is how it gets marked. So uses evidence in an elementary manner, shows little or no understanding of how the MDN challenged the segregatory laws of South Africa's apartheid government, uses evidence partially or cannot write a paragraph. If you bullet point your answers, if you write in phrases and not in full sentences, if you write one sentence, that's not a paragraph, you score very low here in terms of style on level 1. So what you need to do is you need to use relevant evidence from the sources, and you use it very effectively in an organized paragraph that shows an understanding of the topic. Remember, you don't have to stick to the around 80 words. It's not necessary. You can go over it if you wish. So, source 1A, the MDN was formed as a coalition of anti-apartheid groups from grassroots community organizations engaging in the struggle. This is taken exactly from how it is in the source. They used the Freedom Charter as a condition for affiliation. It organized civil disobedience campaigns. It defied state of emergency regulations. It organized defiance campaigns involving multiracial groups. It organized a peace march protest campaign. It staged protest campaigns. Displayed ANC slogans, flags, banners openly. Its activities exposed police brutality. And you'll see that all of this information comes from the sources. Here it says, oh, knowledge, oh, knowledge. So you didn't even need to say these. If you said even just some of these, not all of these, you would have been able to get full marks. So it's not that you needed to use your own knowledge here. You could use the information from the sources. The trick is to take relevant information to the question. So what I want to look at now, in the last 15, 17 minutes we have, is the essay question, particularly the Black consciousness essay question. So I think it might be useful to just conceptualize a timeline quickly. So here, Black consciousness, they talk about the 1970s. So we have Black consciousness in the 1970s, and then we have the crisis of apartheid that we did the source based on. And then we have the negotiated settlement and the government of national unity, democratic elections, and then you have the TRC topic. So that's how it kind of goes. It follows in chronological order as history goes. So with the this question, your essay question, so we have one here that's asking you about the philosophy of Black consciousness and how it instilled Black people with pride and self-belief. So that's one. I would just want to show another example of how they could ask an essay question on this. So let's look at the 2021 past paper for that. Okay, so critically discuss how Steve Biko and the philosophy of Black consciousness mobilized Black South Africans to challenge the apartheid government in the 1960s and 70s. So they're kind of talking about the same thing, but they want you to focus on different things in your response. In this case, you will have to give instances of how it inspired people with pride and self belief, and hear how it mobilized them. So, how it actually drove them to action, where here it's more just pride and self belief. So, remember what we said with essay questions? So, do you agree with this statement? A statement will be given and candidates will be asked to take in a response. So you will have to say, you will say either the philosophy successfully instilled Black people with pride and self-belief or did not. You have to say your stance. Here, where it says critically discuss the statement, so provide evidence with both positive and negative arguments which support or contradict an argument, and then you give your line of the argument. So, in terms then of the 2021 example, you would discuss how, so in both ways, the pros and cons of how it mobilized Black South Africans. So, I'm going to use the 2022 one as an example. So what I just want to point out is in terms of these like breakdowns here, this is basically everything you will need to include in your essay question then. The nature and aims of Black consciousness, the role of Bantu Stephen Biko, the Black consciousness movements, the challenges posed by the ideas of Black consciousness to the state, the 1976 Soweto uprising briefly, and then the legacy of Black consciousness in South African politics. You will see that throughout all the memos for the various essay questions, they all touch on all of these things. It's just how you present it in terms of an argument, because you just use this as evidence for your argument that either yes, it did instill Black people with prior self-belief, or no, it didn't. So I just want to move over to the note packet for the Black consciousness topic. Okay, so you will also see that in the majority of your notes, if whichever notes you're using at school or in your textbook, they will generally follow the headings that are given in the examination guidelines, just because of how the curriculum is set up. So you'll see nature and aims of the Black consciousness movement, nature and aims of the Black consciousness movement, the role of Steve Biko. So you need to take then from this what is relevant to each essay question. So the Black consciousness movement, essentially, just very quickly, was a movement that kind of came into popularity in the 60s and 70s, and it tried to conscientize people about being Black and to take pride in being Black, where under the apartheid regime, it was viewed as something to be embarrassed about, to be shameful about. So it tried to nationalize the people as well and give them pride for being Black, and then standing up together as one, unifying the community. So you will see how the information here is then used to construct an argument here. Okay, so we have our essay question. It says the philosophy of Black consciousness successfully instilled Black people with pride and self-belief to start challenging apartheid South Africa in the 1970s. So pride and self-belief. Do you agree with this statement? So overwhelmingly, the content agrees with this statement. Okay, so we need to say then in our introduction whether we agree with this statement or not, and we do. And the main things we need to prove is that it instilled Black people with pride and self belief. So we would use evidence as instances where it did that. So, what you need to do, candidates need to indicate whether they agree or disagree with the statement. If they agree with the statement, they need to explain how the philosophy of Black consciousness successfully instilled Black people with pride and self belief to start challenging apartheid South Africa in the 1970s. If they disagree with the statement, they need to substantiate their argument with relevant historical evidence. Okay, and then these are the main aspects. So we'll start with the introduction. So remember in our paper one class as well, we said that the introduction needs to be a direct response to your essay question. So you need to say then if you agree or disagree on how the philosophy of Black consciousness successfully instilled Black people with pride. Then you need to say how you will support your line of argument, what you're going to talk about, basically a little roadmap of your essay. So in our case, it would be here. So let's say the nature and aims of Black consciousness, the role of Stephen Biko, and then remember, we need to bring in this idea of pride and self-belief. So we will talk about the nature and aims of Black consciousness, the role of Steve Biko, and then how the Black consciousness movement inspired Black people to have pride, have self-belief. Okay, so that's basically you say what you're going to talk about to substantiate your argument. So this comes from the memo. So what you start with generally, so after your introduction, is you give a little bit of context, a little bit of background, so that because you've been going over the content, but say for example, someone who hasn't been going over the content reads it, so that they just have a little bit of background to see where this fits in. So your background would be, because it says in the 1970s, so your background would be what happened before that that made the Black consciousness movement come about. So there was a political vacuum left after the banning of political parties in 1960, as in a political vacuum, as there was no political resistance parties. Okay. So the Black consciousness philosophy, so now they start talking about what the Black consciousness philosophy is. So instilling Black people with pride and self-belief to challenge the apartheid state. It infused Black people with a sense of pride. It influenced them to accept themselves, have self-confidence. It empowered them to reject the spirit of self-pity, the inferiority complex, and domination by external forces. Instilling the political organizations with self-belief to challenge the apartheid state. So do you see already how just by the philosophy of Black consciousness in itself, we've already proved some of the essay question? Okay, and then here they start getting into like events. And you'll see that they do this chronologically. They start 1968, 1972, 1974, 75, 76. Yeah. So when you're writing your essay, try keep it in chronological order. Otherwise, it just becomes a bit confusing. Okay, so here, the Black Consciousness Movement, SASO organized meetings. They established the United Black Consciousness Movement. So Biko was born. He went on to establish SASO. Here, it speaks about so here, Black students started to organize themselves to resist white domination by breaking away from NUSAS and formed SASO. Black students adopted the philosophy of Black consciousness that shows the role of Biko and SASO. So here where Biko established SASO, he embodied the spirit of community in the Black consciousness movement. Black consciousness led to the formation of the Black People's Convention, which involves students, churches, communities, and trade unions. The unions aligned to the Black consciousness philosophy included the Black Parents Association and the Black Allied Workers Union. South African students movement formed in 1972, which exposed Black people to the ideas of the Black consciousness movement. So that's here, the Black People's Convention, SASO, where they organized rallies. Then here, 1975, Bantu education introduced Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in schools. This is the Soweto uprising part that you will discuss. So here, challenge of Black consciousness to the state. So it is this. So the 1976 Soweto uprising was against Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in schools. So they influenced the formation of the Soweto Students' Representative. Both Black teachers and students rejected Afrikaans. Police response to the student protests, because banishment. They mobilized workers to form trade unions. The role of the media, and you can finish off with the legacy of Biko and the Black consciousness movement, and then you tie up your argument, summarizing very briefly what you said and giving a closing statement. So do you see how there's certain things that you discuss that line up to basically what's written here in your examination guidelines, and how you touch on each of those, but you frame it in a way that you speak about how it would then have instilled pride or uh, self-confidence or in Black people. So linking it each time, speaking about the nature and aims of Black consciousness, and then linking it to the essay question. Speaking about the role of Bantu Stephen Biko, linking it to the essay question. So yeah, I guess that is all from me. I think important to just remember with the history exams is that you do need to study for them. And when you are studying, study smart. Don't study all the topics. Pick the topics that you're going to study and study those. And always just be aware of time, because that's generally across the board kind of a problem that students struggle with in the history papers. Cool. Thank you. So that was it for today's class. Yeah, I really enjoyed teaching this history series. I hope you found it informative and that it helps you prepare for your NSC exams coming up in November, December.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for joining us today. And I'm sure that the students getting ready for their final exams are feeling a bit more relieved because they have these sessions where they can actually revisit their work. Maybe they pick up something that they haven't seen or noticed while they were doing their revision sessions. And we do thank you also for doing the history and giving all of the tips. And it's always useful when you are busy with your final exams.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest
It's
of your day.
It's definitely a pleasure. Thank you so much. That is Danielle Pretorius from the Futures Academy. And this is, of course, for the Voice of the Cape Matric Revision Program 2023 in collaboration with Futures Academy, which is South Africa's online high school. So that concludes today's revision session for History Paper 2, including some examination skills. If you would like to revisit any of the other videos for any of your other subjects or upcoming subjects, you may do so on our YouTube and live streaming pages. So you can still go over as much as you would like. So shukran and thank you to everyone that has been tuning in and that will be rewatching this video at a later stage. And we wish you well in your final examinations. And until you do see our next revision session, Assalamu alaikum to all of you.